Thank you for tuning in to Noire Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Worthy by Jada Pinkett Smith. I first became aware of Worthy. I think I came across an article or something like that online. And initially, I wrote the book off because for the longest while, I felt like Jada Pinkett Smith and Will Smith were weird. And so were their kids. And so I kind of wrote it off because I figured it would be like some celebrity nonsense. But then in the days leading up to the release, I started to see commentary on Instagram, like little quotes and things like that from the book. Little snippets about topics that Jada would be discussing in the book, people commenting and whatnot. And so eventually I became a bit curious. On the morning of the book's release, I went on to Amazon. I was still thinking about whether or not I wanted to read it. And I looked at the reviews. I was surprised that with the book launching that very morning, that there were already some reviews. And it was poorly rated. I think at the time it just had like 1 or 2 stars or something. Now, I've read celebrity books, regular books as well, where you read it and you wonder, how on earth did this book get published? Because be it spelling, grammatical errors, the story is just ridiculous. I figured it might have been something along those lines. That maybe the book was a lot of nonsense. People started reading it and they were rating it poorly because it deserved it. But when I read those early comments, I realized that at this point I'm talking about like maybe 10 reviews. Some of those were positive, like a few, but the negative ones I realized were generally people who disliked Jada Pinkett Smith due to her supposed ill treatment of Will Smith, or some combination of them not liking one or the other. And so because quite a number of those early reviews, well, first of all, I was wondering, like, how did they get advanced copies, or did they get advanced copies that they were able to review the book already? But as I read through the reviews, I came to realize that there was no actual review. Most of those people that left negative early ratings hadn't read the book. They'd made up their mind that just because they previously disliked Jada Pinkett Smith, or like things they heard about the book, that they would leave negative reviews. That was their way of, I guess, taking a stand. I'm not a professional book reviewer or anything like that. I'm not a journalist. I just review books for this channel because I like to read, I enjoy having discussions, and also getting recommendations from other people. But from ethical might not be the word, but from my perspective, I felt it was wrong to leave a review for something that you haven't actually read. It's like, you don't have to agree with the person, with the message of a book or a movie or whatever. You can certainly say, I'm not going to go see this movie. I'm not going to read this book. That's perfectly fine. But a line has to be drawn when you're leaving a negative review or a negative rating and you haven't read the book. You refuse to read the book or watch the movie because you dislike the person. By all means, don't support people or projects that you don't want to support. But you have to draw a line between choosing not to support something and negatively reviewing something that you have not personally read or watched. Because you can't comment to the quality of the project or the information being shared if you haven't read it, right? If you read it, you decide that's not for you, fine. But I feel like you have to be informed to have an opinion on things of this nature. Not so much to have an opinion, really, but to leave a review. And so seeing those early reviews, like some people started leaving positive reviews, positive comments that they were looking forward to reading the book, that they were willing to be a bit more open-minded. And so with that, I decided that to make things fair, I would give it a shot. So I went ahead, I got the audiobook, I started listening to the introduction. Not necessarily under duress, but I felt like, to be fair, I should be open-minded and give it a shot. But I fully went into the book expecting to dislike it. I feel like Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith, they're kind of like wishy-washy, dirty backpacker type people. They live a different life than me, or at least that's the public perception. So Jada narrates the book, she reads the book, and it opens with her surprisingly talking about a time in her life when she was very unhappy with her life and was contemplating suicide, which caught me off guard. And yet still at this point, I was being a bit closed-minded because I remember I went to work the day and I was speaking to a coworker and I told him that, I started listening to Jada Pinkett Smith's book and I was kind of taken aback by the introduction because here's this woman who's famous and wealthy in her own right, but also married to probably one of the biggest stars in the world and thus through him has access to wealth, a great deal of privilege. What could you possibly be upset about? Where does this I'm feeling depressed and I'm thinking about killing myself thing come from? But I decided to go ahead and soldier on through the book. Part of it was initially listening to her read the book. It's not so much that it's dramatic, right? But in the retelling of her life and her being an actress, there's some dramatization, might not be the word, but there's some emotion involved. And I didn't know what to make of it at first. But as I settled into the book and I got through the introduction and she kind of went back in time to the start of her life and started telling her life story, I ended up getting really drawn into the book. I previously knew some things about Jada Pinkett Smith. I knew that she was from Baltimore. I knew that her and Tupac met in high school and they were very good friends, and her mom had struggled with substance abuse. Beyond that she was an actress and then eventually got married to Will Smith and appeared on A Different World. I also knew that she was in Set It Off. I love that movie. But I came to quickly realize that I didn't really know much else about her backstory. I just assumed because her and Tupac were friends in high school and he grew up relatively poor that she was poor as well, that her family was down on its luck, and I was expecting that she'd had this super rough life given her mom was strung out on drugs and that her early life would have been just a complete mess. But in reading the book, it was pretty eye-opening because I realized that wasn't the case, that she actually came from an untraditional background that heavily influenced her as a person as far as her outlook and how she lives her life. But her family was not poor. She actually comes from a solidly middle-class family, where in speaking to her maternal grandparents, her grandfather was a doctor, and this was like back in the 40s or 50s. Her grandfather was a doctor. Her grandmother was one of the pioneers of sexual education in the Baltimore school system, and then like her mother was a registered nurse. So she actually grew up solidly middle class, like to a degree financially comfortable. Now, where things get a little bit sketchy is that seemingly that should have provided some stability. But number one, her parents were high school age teens when her mother became pregnant and she was born. Her mother was 17 at the time of her birth, and her father was somewhere around that age as well. Both of them were wholly unprepared due to their age, but also other factors as well. Right? They weren't in a position to deal with the responsibilities of raising a child. And as she explained, I knew her mother had struggled with substance abuse issues, but I didn't know her father had as well. But both of them had substance abuse issues, but her father started to exhibit these problems in his late teens, early 20s, and it affected the relationship between her parents. I knew I'd heard her make mention of having grown up without her father, but her father began to struggle with substance abuse in his late teens to early 20s, and it was something that he would struggle with for the rest of his life. And as a result of this, initially given the time and her parents' background, her grandmother, and to a degree her grandfather, they kind of pushed for her mom to get married to her dad, which they did. But it turned out to be a volatile relationship where, he was starting to deal with his own issues, and that then brought problems into the relationship, which included domestic violence, physical abuse. The marriage was unsustainable. So while her parents were married at the time that she was born, within a year or so of her being born, her parents were divorced. And from there, her father wasn't really a dependable presence in her life. Despite the issues between her mother and father, her paternal grandparents were very much so actively involved in her life. One of the things that I actually found quite interesting is illnesses and issues that can be seen through generations in a family. So within her family, we see this with substance abuse, meaning both drugs and alcohol, and then also with regards to mental health issues, which I was actually surprised but found quite enlightening. As a result of her mother still being quite young, Jada spent much of her childhood living in her grandparents' house, right? Her and her mother had their own space within her grandparents' house. So it's like, while she grew up with her mother, for much of her life, her mother was more like a quasi-older sister/mom, whereas her grandmother was a huge maternal presence in her life. And her grandfather was a huge paternal presence in her life. Both of her grandfathers actually would end up kind of filling that male role in her life due to her father being unable because he was dealing with his own issues. And she spoke about the love and support that she got in different ways from her paternal grandfather and but then also the strict relationship that she had with her maternal grandmother, where she was a strict, by-the-book kind of person that instilled within her a dedication to cleanliness, thoroughness. She set very high expectations, was very demanding, but at the same time, she was loving in her own way. It was kind of like this thing of a village raising a child. Her mother was still trying to pursue an education to achieve some things for herself in her life, And, given that her father was unable to stay clean, both sets of grandparents stepped up. But yet you notice the impact that it had on her. This thing of, she certainly had positive male role models, but that's not necessarily the same thing as having your father there. And so she spoke about her paternal grandfather specifically, and like the warmth and love that he had for her, that he doted on her, took care of her in a way that we would like to think of fathers taking care of their children. But on the flip side of that, while her dad struggled with addiction, she came to realize that her paternal grandmother as well showed some signs of addiction, but with alcohol rather than drugs. And so there's this pattern of addiction within her family where her paternal grandmother, she wasn't in denial about her son's problems, but didn't really see the role that she might have played in him developing these issues. Not saying it was her fault, but Jada speaks about her grandmother going on these drinking binges on pretty much a weekly basis. That was contrasted with her relationship with her grandfather, where she spoke about it where at times she was quite scared of her grandmother because she would drink and fly into these fits of rage where she would be screaming, carrying on, having an argument with no one, which would terrify Jada, who was quite young at the time. She loved her grandfather for the safety that he represented, where before things could get too out of hand, that he would often step in and kind of calm her grandmother down. But yet still, it's like to be a child, witnessing that kind of stuff and seeing what's going on with her father as well, where his addiction sounds like he was probably stealing and carrying on and whatnot. The instability that they brought when they were in the throes of their addiction, where they could go from being nice, calm, rational people to then just being a completely different person. That would be incredibly scary for a child. So it's quite interesting where on her father's side, you have this thing of addiction. On her mother's side, there was also issues with addiction because her mother would become an addict as well, just a little bit later on. But there were also mental health issues as it was revealed that her maternal great-grandmother was schizophrenic and ended up being institutionalized, which should give some indication as to how serious and severe her illness was. You also get a little bit of insight into, more broadly, what it was like growing up in Baltimore during the 70s to the 80s. I've been to Maryland to visit family in another part of the state, but I've never actually spent any kind of time in Baltimore, mostly just passing through. What I know about the city is from what I've seen on TV, largely The Wire and a few other TV shows. And because those shows are true crime or dramas, they only offered one perspective on the city. So it was cool to get the perspective of someone who was born in the 1970s, came of age during the 80s. So you get the story from her of how the city changed over time through her eyes. As in most places, you have wealthy, middle class, and poor neighborhoods and accompanying forms of crime. When she was a kid and into her early teen years, there were relative dangers that you would find anywhere. But as things moved into the mid to late 80s, when she was deeper into her teens, the presence of drugs changed the city and made some areas more dangerous. In the days leading up to its release, there were these little snippets of the book about topics that she touched on floating around. And she revealed at one point in time in her teens, she'd sold drugs. Not that it's right, but I was surprised by people's reaction to her sharing that. Maybe the difference was her being a female, and with this having been previously unknown, some people seem to be very up in arms about it. You had rappers of all people, for example, 50 Cent, and I think Rick Ross commenting, this was another example of her ill treatment of Will Smith. I didn't get the connection, so I felt maybe I was missing something, and that also ended up contributing to me reading the book to get better insight. You might wonder why a middle-class kid would be selling drugs, but her father had been an addict for her entire life, and while her mother probably started using drugs occasionally while partying, it eventually became a serious problem. Jada started to sell drugs, and her mother's worsening drug use occurred following a traumatic death in their family. People react to trauma and loss in different ways, and it's not always with healthy coping mechanisms. It plunged both of them into what was likely depression, and they made terrible choices as a result. Her mom, now preoccupied with her grief and her addiction, wasn't in the position anymore to really care for Jada, or rather, she let that slip for a moment. Your preteen to early teen years are extremely formative, really into your early 20s, because this is when you're figuring yourself out, figuring out your identity. You're going through tremendous changes as you go from being a child to being an adult, and it can be a very jarring experience. The losses that she experienced at that time and the other changes in her life meant she was dealing with quite a lot. I feel like this is a reason why at that age you see a lot of young men and young women start getting into trouble with the law or they start using drugs. It's a period of time when a lot of kids need guidance, they need help, but parents aren't always able to connect with them. And in this case, with Jada's mom being preoccupied with her own life and her own issues, she didn't really have the time or wasn't paying as close enough attention to be able to provide the support and guidance that Jada needed. At that formative period in her life, she didn't have the parental support and guidance that she needed, and it led to her making some pretty bad decisions, one of which was the decision to start selling drugs. Part of it was a matter of the people that she was hanging around and just the ready availability of drugs on the street. Knowing some of the players made it easier for her to transition into dealing drugs, which is unfortunate, right? As she was going through these things in her life. Something that comes up time and time again is that Jada is a physically small person. I've never seen her in person, but in comparison to other people, you get the feeling that she's quite small. But as she explains, she's like 5 feet, and at that point in her life weighed maybe 90 or 100 pounds. So a very small person, and being out and active in the streets, it meant from a physical standpoint, she was vulnerable. For anyone out in the streets, you're vulnerable because the people that you might compete with, you might have disagreements with, they have access to weapons, you might as well. And when people are doing illegal things, they don't always operate with the strongest moral compass. So violence can sometimes be seen as a solution to problems. And so with that, she found herself in some pretty sketchy situations, being robbed, being held at gunpoint. It's something that I've heard mentioned from watching like documentaries about people who in the past were involved with illegal activity, with dealing drugs specifically. Just how stressful it is, where not only are you worried about the police, but you have to worry about rivals, where they might mean to do you harm. You might have to worry about someone trying to hurt you or kill you or something like that. And so she experienced these traumatic events that had a negative impact on her. Like she was legitimately at risk of losing her life, or by virtue of her being a female, of being sexually assaulted. And not once, but on multiple occasions. And so with that, she describes experiencing what basically sounded like PTSD. But fortunately, she was still going to school while a lot of others would have dropped out and focused exclusively on dealing. But throughout the entire thing, she was kind of like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. She had 1 foot in the street, but was still going to school, actively involved with training as an actress. She met Tupac when they were sophomores in high school, and they formed a really good friendship where they were sort of more like siblings. It would be a relationship where through its duration, you had 2 strong personalities, 2 strong, passionate people who loved each other, but they would also have very fierce arguments. It's something that I wonder about, where with some people, they get into a life of crime or make mistakes early on in their lives, and they're unfortunate to end up in jail for decades or end up being killed. Then you look at stories where things came to a head for Jada, where her mom found out what she was doing and clamped down, actually went as far as to force her to leave Baltimore for college. Like her mother physically removed her from the city. And she was fortunate that some of the people around her, like out in the streets, supported and encouraged her to get out of this life before it was too late. I'm glad things worked out for Jada, but reading things like this always makes me wonder about the people that didn't get that opportunity, what their lives might have been like. Consider some of these people who are spending decades in prison as a result of things they did in their teens. Not to excuse their actions, but what would their lives have been like? Or how might their lives have turned out differently if they had a friend, mentor, or parent to look at what they were doing and to be able to put an end to it, saving them from themselves? Like, think of just how different their lives could have been. The number of people who've wasted decades of their lives in prisons. Not to say they shouldn't have been punished for their crimes, but the world of problems that they could have avoided, the completely different life that they could have had, just by virtue of someone stepping in, being able to really get through to them and put an end to this. Jada isn't the only person whose parents have struggled with drug addiction, alcoholism, or anything along those lines. But she was fortunate in that despite her mother's issues, she was able to pull it together to get Jada back on the right path, to offer her guidance in her time of need, although she didn't even know that she needed it. In any of those situations, number one, Jada could have been killed. Had she continued on, there's a good chance that she would have popped up on the police radar and she could have ended up going to jail. The trajectory of her life would have been completely different. Sometimes in the midst of things, you have a plan for yourself, or there's something that you're intent on doing and it doesn't work out. We view those things as a failure or a disappointment in the moment. And sometimes that is true. But I'm increasingly finding that when you persist and persevere, things in the long term kind of end up working out as they should. There's what we want and the path we want things to take, and then there's how things just naturally work out. In the moment, she was stressed and shaken up about being robbed and held at gunpoint, but ultimately, the fear from those experiences, along with some other factors, helped to put an end to her and this involvement in street life. It made it easier for her to fully invest in pursuing her creative interests and dreams. In the moment, it seemed like the worst thing to happen because her stream of income pretty much dried up when just recently she'd been high school age and making all of this money, having jewelry and all of this cash to the point where she could turn around and help out Tupac. But it ended up being the best thing possible that could have happened for her, as in having that part of her life come to an end, it set her on a better path. There's a huge takeaway because she would go on to arguably have a far better life than she would have had she continued on that path. From there, she explains how she ended up making the move to LA after attending college for, I think, like either a semester or a year, but ultimately feeling like college just wasn't for her. And then this thing of having been involved in like various theater and drama programs throughout her youth, but ultimately deciding to make the move to LA to pursue a career in acting. It was interesting to learn about how Hollywood functions in her early days of trying to get into the industry, the timeline of how things worked out, and people that she met along the way. But even more compelling was learning that she didn't really fit into Hollywood, as she was considered a bit rough and unrefined. I read Will's book earlier in the year, and thinking back on that, their relationship and its shenanigans began to make sense to a degree. What you come to realize is that I do believe in reading both books that they deeply love each other. They have a romantic relationship where they're attracted to each other physically, but also on a mental level as creative people, thinkers, explorers. Yet at the same time, what you realize is that these are two different people who value and prioritize different things. And that's not to say that one course or the other is right or wrong. Will achieved some early success as a rapper, and after things went awry with his financial situation, he then got into acting, and ultimately decided that he wanted to become one of the world's biggest movie stars. And with that, he decided to remove some of the limitations that are typically put on black actors. He achieved a tremendous amount of success and became very enmeshed and ingrained in the world of Hollywood. Jada, on the other hand, seems to enjoy the creative aspect of acting, but not necessarily being famous and everything that comes along with it. Early on in her career, coming from the East Coast and having been involved in street life, she was rough and tumble. It was hard to make the transition to LA, where the expectations for women were different. She was regarded as being rough around the edges, and having achieved some success, wanted to live in Maryland and really just go to LA and New York for work. She made some friends, but it sounds like the environment itself and the fame and all that kind of stuff wasn't necessarily for her. It gives you some understanding as to why her personality might come across the way that it does. Being from New York, people like this don't bother me. I don't mind someone not being bubbly or chatty. Before Will, she was dating guys, but not really pursuing serious relationships and had no interest in marriage, though considered maybe having a child in the future. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, as long as you're honest with the people that you're dating. Not wanting to get married was due in part to her parents and their relationships. But basically, she wasn't really looking forward to this traditional all-American dream of being married with kids, but rather wanted to do her own thing. And I think in part, some of that comes from the examples of the women that she grew up around. Her maternal grandmother, who played a very large role in helping to raise her, was also non-traditional in her own way. Yes, she was married and did have children, but a lot of her views and outlooks were what could be considered outside the norm. And so growing up in that environment where she was told from a very young age that she had the right to chart her own path and be her own person, she ended up taking that to heart, where some of the goals, dreams, and aspirations that are a foregone conclusion for women weren't necessarily things that she wanted for herself. She was raised by a woman who encouraged her to seek her own happiness, to define herself, and to be her own person. That's part of why you have this seeming dislike that some people have for her, because she seemingly just does whatever she wants, which is something that people tend to be more comfortable seeing in men. When you have a woman, especially a black woman, who decides and defines for herself who and what she wants to be and is fairly unapologetic about that, some people don't like it. People should be given leeway to be their own persons and to pursue their own interests, their own happiness. And I think as long as what you do doesn't infringe on the rights or liberties of anyone else and you're not lying to anyone in the process, then to each his own. I don't think you're obligated to live your life for anyone else or according to anyone else's rules, because most other people, they don't have that desire to either. But I just thought it was very interesting to read about. It helped to give a different understanding, learning more about her background and her rationale. Not that she owes anyone an explanation, but I think it's fair for celebrities and people along those lines where so much is written about them, assumed about them, people offer commentary about them, that at some point they have the right to then, if they choose to speak up, to state their own opinion and to tell their own story. It's like if everyone else has an opinion on you and what you do, I think you're well within your rights then to share your own as well. I've never disliked Jada or Will Smith. I just thought they were kind of weird. But as the book went on, I actually found myself liking her more. Sometimes on the outside looking in, number one, I like entertainment as far as movies, good television shows, books, music, but I don't really take much of an interest in the lives of celebrities. But it was insightful here. Her views and opinions might not exactly match my own, but at the same time, I found some shared traits and beliefs. I found myself thinking back and looking back over my own life. Reading about other people's experiences challenges you to think about your own beliefs and why it is that you believe what you believe. It offers opportunities for you to learn and grow. In years past, I used to say that I wasn't really into like self-help books or these types of books because they seem kind of wishy-washy. In years past, I used to say that I wasn't really into self-help books or these types of books because they seem kind of wishy-washy. I'm not planning to live their lifestyle, but in reading about their lives and experiences, it caused me to look at my own life and my own experiences, to question things, or not so much events, but to look back on moments from my life and to think about them, to look at some of my beliefs and to question them, to think about them. And I think an important part of life is learning and growing, remaining open to new ideas and experiences. And so it's one of the things that I enjoyed in reading this book. So Jada explains her thought process, her beliefs, and there's a lot of things that I don't necessarily agree with. But you can still think for yourself and you can have your own beliefs that don't necessarily align with other people's, but especially in topics that you have limited knowledge of or you don't know anything about, rather than just coming to a conclusion without any kind of thought or without any kind of consideration or assessment. I think that kind of closed-mindedness that I don't need to know about this, but yet I have an opinion on it, I just don't understand that. I think you do yourself a great disservice. And so I ended up really appreciating this book. And I think between Worthy and Will by Will Smith, it's actually opened me up to reading more books that are beyond just like the hard and straightforward topics, be that like fiction or nonfiction, but to also seek out books that push me to question myself, to question my beliefs, goals, and the things that I claim are important to me, right? Versus the things that are actually important to me. The things that you pursue versus the things that actually make you happy in life. The things that you go after because it's what you're told you should want versus if you're really looking deep within yourself, what do you truly want? What do you truly value? What makes you as an individual happy? I came really close to dismissing this book because I felt Jada was a weirdo and didn't really care about what she had to say about anything. But in kind of pushing past my own closed-mindedness, and saying, well, before I dismiss this out of hand, let me go ahead and read the book and form an informed opinion. I'm glad that I did because number one, I realized that she's not necessarily weird, just like different. She has like different outlooks and beliefs because she's had different experiences. And then in addition to that, we might not share the same beliefs, but this journey that she's gone through of figuring herself out, Now, granted, her and Will have far more money at their disposal, so the way they go about doing that is different. But it's also motivated and inspired me as well to go on my own journey of self-development and self-discovery, figuring out what it is that I want in life versus what I feel like I should want. If you don't take anything else away from the book, the factor of defining for yourself, sitting down, assessing and analyzing yourself and your life and what you want from it is probably the most important takeaway. Certainly, read the book for the details of things that have happened in her life if you're interested, as she does discuss her relationship with Will, them at times being at odds. She gives her perspective on specific events like her entanglement, the incident between Will and Chris Rock at the Oscars, and I actually respected her addressing those events because some people would just gloss over those things, like not mention them at all. But I appreciated her honesty in sharing because it's not perfect or pretty at times. From the outside looking in, she's married to this big superstar, they're wealthy, from a financial perspective, all of their needs are being met, but still feeling depressed and having all of these other feelings and emotions, being suicidal at points. It really shows the importance of mental health, where she struggled with mental health issues and depression for much of her adult life. And it's a conversation that I think is extremely helpful. As time goes on, people are becoming more open to discussing these formerly taboo topics, having a mental breakdown, being on medication, but still struggling. And this is someone with a wealth of financial resources at their disposal. Imagine what it might be like for someone without those resources. So it's like, with her and Will, people just assume that she's the problem. And that's not the case, reading both of their books. He's not the problem either. It's a matter of, in a relationship, you have two people, neither one of them is perfect, and at times they both grate on each other's nerves. And things are good at points, and then things are not at other points. People don't necessarily deal with issues in the most healthy or appropriate manner, but you try to work through them. And like I said, I think a large part of the pushback or negativity that people seem to have towards her releasing this book is to some degree because they like to control women. They're both kind of weird, right? But I don't remember any of this blowback or anyone questioning why Will was writing a book. The negative reactions to her sharing her experiences come from this belief that some people have that women shouldn't have a voice, or that women should only have a voice when they're saying things that people want to hear, or that are in alignment with what people think and believe women should think and believe. Women who step outside the norm by not following the playbook can inspire vitriol in some people. I'm all for people being themselves, expressing themselves. And by the end of the book, I like Jada Pinkett Smith. I still don't have a deep interest in her as like an individual and, or their marriage, but I do wish them both the best. I highly recommend this book. I think that in reading it, there's a lot to take away from it. There's a lot to learn from it. I think it's worth checking out. And if you do, let me know what you think. I'm really interested in not having a one-sided conversation, but rather an open dialogue about this book. I think for individuals who, are in romantic relationships or even general relationships, platonic friendships as well, there's this thing where we as individuals, we have our perspectives, and we don't also always necessarily take time to consider that other people have their own perspectives as well. There's not necessarily you're right, I'm wrong type situation all the time, but more frequently, it's that you've had your experience, I've had mine. We as a result have different outlooks and our own feelings, and we kind of have to work to align those things. And so with that, I think this book it's very interesting on multiple levels, and I highly recommend it. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.